سبيل الدموع سبيل مريح تنهدى يا صاحي كي تستريح وبث الدعاء الخفي الصريح يسعك الفضاء الرحيب الفسيح سبيل الدموع سبيل.
Now the first three phases were particularly based on invasions. It's the fourth phase which is the interesting part, and that's the mass migration which took place in the last century or so. And we saw, particularly after the Second World War, the links between Muslims and Europe, the German states link particularly there, and we saw this growing. Well, even before the Second World War, we had links. There were links between the Muslim world and the Europeans. There were, for example, a particular Muslim Prussian unit that fought alongside the King Frederick in the Russian army, or those who had deserted from the Russian army. And we see even in Berlin a masjid was built in the grounds in order to allow the Muslims to be buried there. So we can see that even prior to Second World War there was a good connection, but it was after the Second World War that we saw a remarkable change taking place, and it was this remarkable change which brought about a large number of Muslims into Europe. And the European Economic Community, the EEC, had around sort of in 1991 anyway about 10.4 million Muslims there, and this was about 3% of the total population. And we can see that these Muslims were continuing to grow in this particular area in Europe, and the migrancy that came due to this carried on into the 60s and 70s. But we also saw an influx of more educated Muslims coming in for different reasons, either through family reunions or for political reasons. And the idea was initially anyway that the Muslims would arrive on these lands, and once they would arrive on these lands they would take up whatever jobs were available to them, earn a living, earn some substantial amount of money, maybe even send some money back home, and then they would eventually go. The government were happy because what the government was hoping for was a hard-working group of people who they could come in and disappear, and it would mean, you know, a lot easier to do a job which they didn't have the manpower or the willing manpower available. And this was ideal for them. So everybody was quite happy with this arrangement. The folk coming over, the government here, it was a quick job. The government was even happy, the employers were happy, everybody was happy it was going to work perfectly well, and then we'd have the problem resolved. The only issue was that when people did arrive, they kind of stayed a lot longer than what they thought they would stay. So this returning home kind of idea became slowly a myth, until it's even described as a myth of return, where people never actually thought that they would go back. So you have people now who've been living in this country for 50, 60 years and have never returned. They might return for visits, but they've never returned back. They've never gone back to that country which they always described as their homeland, the country where they were born. They've never returned to take up permanent residency. So you can see now that this wasn't really organized, particularly if we're focusing on the Muslim minority community, it wasn't really organized. It was a case of Muslims arriving. There was no plan there. There was no plan to say, well, how do we integrate this community into that's arriving on our lands? What do we do about it? There was nothing arranged, nothing focused, no real effort made. In fact, I can recall many of those years. I was around in the 70s and in the 80s, and the high level of racism that existed on the streets of Bradford, and the high level of racism that existed in schools and in all public space was absolutely incredible. It's unheard of now what people when you mention to young people in places like Bradford and Birmingham and places where they have a large majority Muslim community, of what people had gone through. They just think it's a world that never existed. But I hear from other individuals who do live in more diverse communities where that level of blatant racism still exists, and particularly after Brexit, particularly after what's going on now, this Islamophobia rise that's taking place. You see quite a significant amount now going on. You won't hear that on the streets of Bradford. You won't see that on the certain streets in Birmingham and in Blackburn and all these various places which have a dense Muslim population. So you can see again arguably why Muslims choose to live there, because they feel safe. Because now we're starting to see the rise of racism again. And there's many stories that I could share with you about the level of racism that used to exist. Where my father's workplace, and he worked as a weaver at a mill, and he recalls many stories to me. One particular story was the foreman wanted to be sort of saluted at by his workforce when he would arrive on the sort of shop floor. And similarly, we see that whenever the white workers would take a break in the office at lunchtime, whereas the Asian, the Pakistanis or Indians and Bengalis, they would actually take break whilst working with their machines. And we can talk about safety. Health and safety was absolutely ridiculous. Didn't exist. People losing fingers and losing their eyesight and everything else that goes with it. And that was a world that people grew up in. That was a world in which my father was engaged. There was no, let's look after this Muslim communities, let's look after this Asian community, let's help them integrate, let's make life easy for them. There wasn't that much. I must say on the other side as well, in terms of the government was, particularly when we move on to the sort of 80s and move into the 90s, we start to see the government trying its best to make sure that education programs were put in place, interpreters were available, so that individuals could go to places and where people would interpret on their behalf. But that really came a lot later. It didn't sort of happen too much in the 50s and 60s and the 70s. So we have this myth now, and we have this community now that's living within Europe, within Britain, which is now becoming, it's fixed. It's a community which exists, and due to the situations that a few individuals were involved in when it comes to 7/7 or 9/11 or all the other events which have happened since then, those very few individuals who profess this religion and these co-religionists who also share that religion, because of these incidents, the whole Muslim community now is seen as a problem. Yet this Muslim community has been in the UK for close to coming up to nearly 100 years now, as a sizable community, and no problems have been envisaged as such up until the last sort of decade or so. So that's something to think about. We also see individuals who pick up this problem and see it as and globalize it. A number of authors, for instance, have said that the struggle between Christianity and Islam has gone on for millennium, and the 21st century is no different. It's just the style has changed. So instead of outright war, we see infiltration, as his words are, of Muslims into the Christian heartlands. And then what they're slowly doing is localizing themselves, putting themselves in positions of power. And when they're all in these positions of power, then they'll overthrow all these Western governments and they will take over the world, the so-called global Islamic threat. The arc of crisis. You see many politicians use these sorts of words as well, both in the UK and in the US, giving this image of the secret infiltration. They don't like our values, they're against our values, they don't like our country, they hate our freedom. All this kind of rhetoric which is used, which is all trying to build a particular type of image in the minds of people. But this isn't all fact, it's not just all one-way street. We see that in Europe in particular, Muslims are misrepresented in the media and they're discriminated against by non-Muslims. Lots of issues and things which we take. Let's take it on a more national level. Turkey, for instance. Turkey has attempted to join the European community and has made great effort. However, numerous individuals hesitate. There's some statements, some references that I have here, where one particular German diplomat said that if Turkey was to join Europe, then the Turkish membership would dilute the EC's Europeanness. And that's an interesting point to note. What he seems to be suggesting here, that Islam or Muslim is anti-Europe. Islam and Europe is not the same sort of thing. We've also seen in the past that delegates, particularly from Germany, Italy, Poland and Slovakia, wanted to include within the new European constitution the term Christian heritage. And this was overruled and removed because of the sensitive nature, and instead the words cultural, religious and humanist inheritance of Europe. So what culture, religion and humanist inheritance has Europe had? So indirectly saying the Christian influence on Europe. Now, but how did Europe come about? How did Europe come about? Well, Europe is based on, by a number of authors, on four key influences. One is the Roman Empire, the other one is Christianity, the Enlightenment and industrialization. And because these four things didn't happen within the Islamic world, then it's arguably suggesting that Muslims can never be part of Europe because they didn't experience the same thing that Europe has experienced. But that's not necessarily true, because you could argue that Islam has existed within Spain for a lot longer. But you can also see why, even though Spain is geographically part of the continent Europe, when it was part of the Islamic world, if I can use that, it wasn't considered as part of Europe. So even though it was, if you look at it physically, it's physically in the European continent, it wasn't included as Europe by the Europeans when the Muslims had authority over it. So we seem to be getting an idea that Islam is seen as the antithesis of Europe. It's not the same thing. And this is based on this historic understanding, or this historic relationship between Muslims and between Christians. Because Europe, if we take some of these definitions, is based on this Christian heritage. So, Europe being other than Islam, Europe being something that's separate than Islam, arguably something which is negative to Islam. Further, individuals who argue this particular narrative will say that the Enlightenment was an aspiration to go beyond tradition, to rely on universal dictates of reason and method, and Islam is based on tradition. The Europeans would argue, we had our Enlightenment. We've gone beyond religious sort of dogma. We've gone beyond believing and acting upon certain things which are going into the scientific world about what the earth looks like, what exists beyond the sun, what exists beyond Jupiter. We've gone, we've challenged dogma, the Europeans will say, and we've put kind of reason and method, a reasonable method and these sorts of things in place in order to make humans a better people and a better society. So Europe has moved on. Islam is still based on tradition. It still harks back to a world centuries ago, which Europe did as well, but Europe's kind of broken those shackles and moved on. Having said that though, continentally speaking, Europe's largest city is a Muslim city, Istanbul. Parts of Spain, as we've mentioned already, have been more Islamic been Islamic for longer than they've been Catholic. And if it hadn't been for the Muslim factor, the European Renaissance wouldn't have taken place. And the fact that the church does not exist in Islam means there's no need for an enlightenment, because Islam has always managed to balance reason and allow reason to play a huge part within science and not allow dogma to impact on science as much as it did within the European setting. So in other words, what we're saying is Islam doesn't need to have the same European experience in order to be part of Europe. So we have one view which gives this kind of clash of the civilizations scenario, where you've got sort of a group of people and another group of people, and they're actually defined by being not this group. And as soon as this group becomes part of this group, it's seen as problematic. But we're now starting to see the lunacy on this clash of civilizations attitude, and the lunacy of seeing Muslims as a problem, and the lunacy of seeing a Muslim community as something which won't work. And you're starting to see the dialogue changing. And we're now talking about, instead of Islam versus the West, we're saying Islam and the West, or even as far as going Islam in the West, to even European Islam. So the words are changing, and this is an important time for these conversations and this dialogue to take place, because we're seeing the Muslim community in Europe will increase in size significantly in the next few years. And not only that, this won't be solely due to migration, even though there's a huge influx of migration into Europe as we speak right now due to the crisis in Syria, but it's also because the population of the Muslims that's growing within Europe itself as citizens of each country, not necessarily new migrants. Another argument that's held as well is that the Muslim community, on generally speaking, have larger, or because of their Asian descent, have larger families than, say, your average white couple. So there you see these 3 or 4 reasons why the Muslim population is growing significantly over the next sort of few years and the impact it have. So we've got to be quite optimistic. We can look at it negatively or positively. The positive way to look at it is, like we see in Australia, for instance, that Muslims are being integrated very well. They have a recognition of their rights. And so even though the Muslims lose their cultural identity, they retain their religious identity. And we said that throughout, the culture identity is what you link yourself to, what you associate yourself to. So if you consider yourself to be a Pakistani, then you may dress like a Pakistani. If you consider yourself to be an African, you might dress like an African. Those are your cultural choices. But religious identity is different, because a person may dress in a certain way because of his religious identity. Or he may eat in a certain way or practice certain things in a certain way. So we saw that in Australia. But we saw the opposite. We saw the Muslim community isolated and denied its rights, and that can also take place. And what will happen is, then either the community becomes permanently isolated, you have distrust, potential war, civil war breaks out, or this community disengages completely, whilst the host, if I can use that word, community try to assimilate these people into leaving their religious ways. And if people say, well, that's never going to happen, well, we've seen expulsions and even genocide in Western countries, as we saw in Bosnia during the Balkan Wars. So it can happen. A community can be ostracized, a community can be picked on, and there, if you look at the Balkans War in particular, those individuals, you couldn't tell them apart ethnically, not to the common eye anyway. So they would look very similar, whereas a Muslim from South Asian descent, from the Indian and from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, you'll see from the Indian subcontinent, you'll see that they're distinctively different than your average person who's living in England. So you're seeing a bigger difference. So the expectations can be there, but we shouldn't be negative. We should be optimistic and positive. And we saw similarly that this kind of existed between the German Catholics, and they were seen as disloyal citizens because their links to Rome. It seemed that they were prioritizing their religious links to Rome rather than their links to Germany. But with time and understanding, the state recognized that the identity, their religious identity, was something else, and it had no negative impact on their nationalistic identity. And this was just a misunderstanding, which was slowly, with time, the situation cleared up. That's what's hoped now, and we saw numerous recommendations made about how the Muslim community can also be integrated into wider British society in order for it to also survive and feel confident and prosper within that environment. So let's sort of touch upon, and I'm conscious of time, and I don't want these lectures to drag too long, and that's to just sort of bring you up to speed on a few topics before we bring our lecture to a close. We talk about Muslims living in Britain itself. We've seen the link, the East India Company that predominantly recruited from Indian ports. So by this, as they sailed across, British Muslim sailors arrived in Britain, and they were living in London in boarding houses. We also see, due to the Suez Canal in 1869, Yemeni and Somalian sailors were recruited there, made their way back to places in Cardiff and South Shields. And you start to see that Muslim men married British women and started to settle permanently. So this is even before World War I and World War II. We had one particular individual, Sheikh Abdullah Henry William was his original name, Quilliam. Obviously now the word Quilliam is become a dirty word, even though it's obviously suggested at this particular time this chap was a decent chap who accepted Islam in 1887 when he went to the Ottoman Empire and Morocco. Eventually he had the grand title of Sheikh al-Islam for Britain by the Ottoman Sultan and the Shah of Persia, and he had a significant following in Liverpool, and he converted a row of terraced houses to be used for prayer, festivals, weddings, funerals, and a boys' day school, evening classes, hostel, library and printing press. Eventually he left Britain, went to the far Muslim lands, and what he did disappeared. And there were other individuals as well. We have Dr. Leitner, Hungarian Orientalist, as well that existed. But I just want to sort of just skim over that, and I have recommended to you that you get a copy yourself, so you can actually look at some of these things in more detail at your own speed and leisure. Muslims in Britain post Second World War. I've told you how, due to the political the pushes and the pulls, a Muslim community arrived in the UK. They took up places. We see, for example, that they are found throughout Britain, but we see quite a sizable number is in particular areas. So, for instance, London has the highest number of Muslims in the country, 8.5% of its population. But the boroughs, if you break them down, are highly concentrated in certain areas. Tower Hamlets, 36.4%. Newham, 24.3%. Excuse me. And then we've got Birmingham, which is 14.3%, and that's around 140,000 Muslims, and Bradford, which is 75,000 Muslims, 16%. Unusually young as well. And one way that we can see the kind of established Islam in these cities is the development of the masjid. And you can see the increase of masjids, both in, originally just being buildings, rooms, houses, which have been converted to being mosques, to actually purpose-built mosques, which we now see quite magnificent, glamorous-sized mosques as well. Huge buildings with sort of multi-million pound budgets in order to build them. So we can slowly see that these Muslims are growing in confidence, being able to set up their own places of worship, set up their own places to eat, and things of that nature. We've seen as well within the media, in particular when we saw a recent study carried out, and this was by Cardiff University, and they looked at the British Muslims between the years 2000 and 2008, and they found that the reporting had increased over the years, and it peaked in 2006. But what it peaked for wasn't good news. The explanation for this is that the world events and the increase in the coverage of terrorism, we found 36% of stories involving British Muslims were about terrorism. 36%. In a way, what that's saying is, if we say there's around 5 million Muslims now, that 36%, I'll let you work out the maths, 360,000 times 5, that level, really, it should have been proportional. That the number of individuals, arguably, who've been arrested or sentenced, not arrested, because there's been lots of arrests, and the arrest to actual prosecution ratio is ridiculous as well. But those who've been successfully prosecuted and actually been jailed for that activity, compared to the total population, is so different than 36%. You're talking probably 0.36%, if not even lower. Yet those were the stories. We saw as well that in 2008, 32% of the stories was the difference between British culture and Islam. And that overtook, in 2008 anyway, the Muslims and terrorism. So we can see that there were three ways in which Muslims were being described. And that is that two-thirds, you heard it right the first time, of reporting focused on Muslims in a negative way, by either describing them as a threat in relation to terrorism, a problem in terms of difference in values, or both. That was Muslim extremism in general. So two-thirds of what the media was giving out was based on that. Now, as we don't see, and we all agree, that there aren't many places where non-Muslims and Muslims are coming together. There are some, but it doesn't happen. There's not many people who can say, I've got a friend, and it's increasing, but who's a Muslim or a non-Muslim. It's slowly increasing, but it's still not a high number. So most of us are going to become aware of the other, if I can use that word. And since the non-Muslims are the majority in England, then they're going to become aware of Muslims through the media. There's no other way that they're going to be. If they don't have anybody that they work with, there's nobody that they go to college or uni with, or nobody they go to school with, then they're only going to come across them through the media. Now, if the media is saying, two-thirds of the reports are putting the Muslims in this negative light, then without any shadow of doubt, this is having a huge impact in the mind of the person. So his perception of Muslims is going to be very negative. So this builds up a perception. There's one particular part which I'll quote actually. It says, it goes on to report, the language used about British Muslims reflects the negative or problematic context in which they tend to appear. 4 of the 5 most common discourses used about Muslims in the British press associate Islam, Muslims with threats, problems, or opposition to dominant British values. That's 4 out of the 5 most common discourses. So, for example, the idea that Islam is dangerous, backward, or irrational is present in 26% of stories. No religion faces that. The conclusion the report reaches is condemning, to say the least. Decontextualization, misinformation, and a preferred discourse of threat, fear, and danger, while not uniformly present, were strong forces in the reporting of British Muslims in the UK national press. In our view, it is our view rather that this is simplistic, sensationalist, and even biased reporting of Muslims is a contributing factor in the perception of Muslims as a problem, and in the perpetuation of this perception, and that this needs to be challenged by both Muslims and non-Muslims. So this huge propaganda machine that some parts of the media are giving this message of British Muslims as a huge problem. And I don't want to go into any more detail really, because I think I just wanted to sort of get an idea of Muslims, how they've experienced Britain and how they arrived and how they're being perceived. And before I move on to sort of bringing today's discussion to a close and just introducing the next couple of lectures which will come up after these two lectures, because as I understand, for some of us, for our channel, this will be split into two parts, the one that we're covering today, and for our other channel, the Hanafi fiqh channel, then this will be played as a one in totality. Not saying that the people on the Hanafi fiqh channel can stay awake for longer, it's just the way we've set it, because there's other scholars who are using the Hanafi fiqh channel as well. So it allows us to keep pace of both our series kind of close together, if not in tandem. Now, when we do talk about laws, there's various fiqh positions. We have the Hanafi school, and the Hanafi school, which was founded by Imam Abu Hanifa and his two students, Abu Yusuf and Muhammad al-Shaybani. This is going back around 772 or around 150 Hijri, and Abu Yusuf 182 Hijri, 804 Common Era, and Muhammad al-Shaybani 189 Hijri and 811 Common Era. And they were based in what's present-day Iraq. This school was actually practiced by law in a number of Islamic empires, including the last empire, which was the Ottoman Empire, and today it has the largest adherents and followers in various parts of the Arab world, Asia, and Africa. We have then the Maliki school, which takes its name from the founder Imam Malik. Was based in Medina, and we see slightly different approach, and we see North Africa, West Africa, the Shafi school, and the Hanbali school, and we also have the two Shia schools, which is the Jafri and the Ismaili. And there's different in the Sunni schools because they look at who can interpret. So they will say, for example, that the Imams are the only ones who are capable of interpreting God's law. The Jafri school goes back to Imam Jafri Siddiq, as is referred to, radiallahu anhu, the sixth Imam and the great-great-grandson of the Khalif Ali. As according to the Shiism, the 12th and the last Imam, who has the same laqab, Abu al-Qasim Muhammad, he's gone into occultation on the 252 Hijri and will reappear end of time. So they must interpret the law to the best of their abilities. The Ismailis are different than Jafris in their belief that the Imam continues to exist from generation to generation. And you find these laws being practiced in the Jafri school, having the greater following, being practiced in Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon. So you can see here that there is some element of taking a different approach. The concept of a pluralistic approach has existed within Islam. If we look at the Sunni school in particular, 4 legal schools, and in the early stages there were more than 4 legal schools, all kind of working, entwined together, and yes, there were the debates and the arguments, but there was no one actually condemning others for saying that this person is not a Muslim or what he's doing is not based on sound law. And we see some countries offering this service, the ability to be able to practice and exercise some autonomy in their judicial matters. For example, in the Philippines, we see Muslim personal law existing with states, family law. So it allows the Muslims to practice that law in their case. And Britain is no different. People might sort of freak out when I say the next part, but there is Islamic law practiced in Britain. Yes, there is. Where? Well, simply when you look at halal meat, the fact that meat can be slaughtered according to Islamic law, is Islamic law. So it is being practiced, and Muslims aren't the only ones. Jews also have this law which permits them to carry out. We see, for example, certain type of uniform changes, girls wearing headscarves or wearing long trousers in uniform as a uniform in schools. We see other areas well where local authorities take into consideration. For example, the building of mosques. That's Islamic law being practiced. The building of graveyards for Muslims in a certain direction, pointing towards the Qibla, pointing towards the Kaaba. And so we can see, and also employers allowing some flexibility to their employees with certain dress codes, being able to celebrate certain religious festivals, going on holiday for that reason, and also providing some service in terms of prayer. So you can see that pluralism does exist. Okay, pluralism does exist because without so when people say, there's only British law and that's it. Well, that's not necessarily true, because pluralism has existed for a long length of time. And the thing is, it's the word law which is problematic, because the pluralism or legal pluralism is an attribute of the social field, not the legal system. It's how an individual can allow two legal systems to exist within a social space. So it does exist. We have unofficial and official laws. So we have the concept of nikah, which is marriage, and the concept of talaq, which is divorce. And this is Islamic law, and it's working hand in hand with the English legal law. So even though a person will marry through nikah, they may not marry through the registry system, but they are still legally married. Then the state might not consider them to be legally married, but according to Muslim law, they are legally married. And there's some differences between the two, which I'm sure you can see in your own time as you address the text yourself. So what I want to do is just sort of bring this to a close, and what we can see here is that Muslims have had some kind of relationship, somewhat antagonistic and a kind of aggressive relationship earlier in the first sort of time, particularly Islam in its early sort of days, and the positions that the Muslim world and the Christian world took towards one another. We saw that kind of changed, and with the advent of the world wars and the Commonwealth, we saw Muslims now working and going shoulder to shoulder into battle with other non-Muslims. And we saw then Muslims picking up permanent residency within the country. We saw two potential positions which the government or the host nation can take. One is seeing the Muslims as a problem, and one is seeing the Muslims as different, or a partner, a different partner. So those who see it as a problem are pushing towards assimilation, which is pushing the Muslim community towards isolation, and as a result potentially taking extremist positions and causing more problems, or deciding to leave. And if we see the host government, sort of non-Muslim government, seeing the Muslims as a partner, as an equal partner, but different, then you start to see that people are working more closely together. The Muslim community opens up and works quite freely and well within the greater community and society. What we'll do next for the next couple of lectures is touch upon the hermeneutic approaches to religious texts. Now, we mentioned in the introduction that the religious texts, the source texts, are absolutely essential, and how they interpret it is absolutely essential as well. It is that area that we will look at, and I hope you can join me again for those two, inshallah ta'ala. Wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
سبيل الدموع سبيل مريح تنهدى يا صاحي كي تستريح وبث الدعاء الخفي الصريح